in a cell configuration would be touch permissive, whereas a spherical cell would tend to hold all the inertia in the spin that it finds itself. This is helpful to understand the true medical definition of cancer, which is what's called contact inhibition. In other words, if touch does not inhibit replication, that is the definition of cancer. Well, ultimately, permission to touch is this ability to create a path for the ultraviolet to leave the cell. And the ultraviolet, the blue fire, the sex juice, can't leave the cell unless there's a harmonic cascade between membranes called wet-making power, which is how Faber d'Olivet translated the word Eve as in Adam and Eve, Ieva, to make wet, or to make word, or to give permission to touch by arranging for the symmetry on the surface of donuts or soap bubbles. Wet-making power. And in fact, surfactants can be very profound, that is, surface tension reduction, like lecithin or detergent kind of actions, can be very interesting therapies for certain kinds of cancers. For exactly that reason, that the path out of the cell for the blue fire sex juice means that only if the ultraviolet is stuck inside the cell with no place else to go does it become promiscuous, that is, have kids too soon, that is, divide prematurely. For exactly the same reason that a young girl or young boy, given lots of creative outlets, guitar playing and dances and lots of creative things to do, doesn't have to become promiscuous and get fixated on sex at too early an age and not have a more refined channeling of the creative juices up the spine to other creative processes. Whereas a young person that's not given all these wonderful creative outlets becomes promiscuous because there's nothing else to do with the ultraviolet blue fire sex juice. So here we're seeing that this wave mechanical understanding of the bliss juice of the living cell not only helps us understand cancer, but begins to give us a language to talk about the spiritual use of sexual energy, which is part of the main subject of this next part of our little conversation. The blissful urge to touch between people, which is really behind sexual energy, can have very, very useful and profound spiritual import or power. At a very fundamental level, when this ultraviolet creative juice is gathered from cellular metabolism, some of the things that affection and touch and even foreplay can do is to assemble this field effect of coherent ultraviolet in a bubble which is wave-guided by the long wave of attention and touch and foreplay and the sounds of the heart, for example. And ultimately, in the description of spiritual sexuality, we will be talking about Tantra and Kundalini. And for that, we will have a simple model to understand how this gathered ultraviolet creative field effect, or sex juice, or blue fire, proceeds up the spine. And I often call this the plumbing 101 for bliss. And it's helpful to understand how the tailbone works to act as the switch for this straw. In Gurdjieff, there's this description of what he calls the organ kunda buffer, which he said is an organ near the tailbone that acts as the switch for whether or not the juice goes up the spine. And ironically, or interestingly, in Tai Chi, there is this concept of the pelvic tilt, which is used to release the angle of the tailbone, so it's almost like the curvature of the lower tailbone is unpacked just a little bit. And one of the results of this process is that the tailbone has the possibility of an opening in the end that functions like a straw or a tube. But initially it takes some hydrodynamic pressure to break that open in some people. And also there's another aspect of the tailbone, which is what I call vestigial horse hairs, which it was basically the hairs around our original tail when we were monkeys. And those hairs have an ultraviolet and a microwave conductive quality. They're waveguides. So together, for example, in the male, they can wrap themselves around the prostate. Speaking of permission to touch, here's Kitty. We must be doing it right here, huh? So the tailbone becomes the place where the harmonics of the spine juice begin to pump. Oh, the kitty seems to... See, the kitty was drawn to exactly where this ultraviolet is being gathered. She's touching my tailbone with her tail right now. It's interesting. And Seth used to say that the kitties were astral antennas, right? Well, the reason that Kitty is attracted to that charge is the same way that people are, is because any place we gather that ultraviolet blue fire juice is a place where biology knows that information is about to change hands. It's like the modem is about to be hooked up. So anyway, what happens is then, once, instead of going downward in conventional orgasm, the creative juices begin to be pumped upwards. And the long wave sound of the heart harmonics become a peristalsic pump, which is just like the cilial hairs of the intestines sweeping along the food. The long wave sounds are the snake charmer, which is the pump for the spine juice. This is called a sacrocranial pulse, and I believe Bentoff documented in Stalking the Wild Pendulum the way in which the heart sounds phase-locked the liquids of the ventricles of the brain, which are made of the same stuff as the spine juice. So the spine juice pumping the long waves in the spine, which Upledger at the Upledger Institute in Florida showed, were such that if the spine liquids were pumping, and this is a longer wave, slower than the pulse, but phase related to the heart, pumped by but different than, then it was clinically impossible to be depressed. Essentially, it means that the nature of what arrives at the dripping nectar of sweetness on the back of the tongue, nature's sort of primordial reward for entering into bliss, is that the brain is nourished by the highest frequency gathered cellular emissions, the UV, the blue fire. So you taste this sweetness. It's also true that in the male, for example, you can have a clear prostatic emission, thick but clear out the penis, where the haploid white sperm cells have gone up the spine. And in the female, there are, for example, descriptions of virgin birth, which are a very deep meaning because it is indeed charge that splits the egg. And this will bring us to some interesting pictures, which we will take a break and look at. So in order to understand how it is that it is in fact charge that splits the egg, we look at this place where the sperm arrives at the skin of the egg at the moment of human conception. And we see that what actually happens, among other things, when described electrically, is that the sperm delivers a charge wave that causes the egg to start a little tornado where it begins to dimple right here. It starts to look like an apple. And that little tornado, if the dimple goes all the way through the egg, turns it into a donut, and that's what starts the turning inside-out process, which precipitates then the cell division, where you have this 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13 Fibonacci progression of number of cells, but it all starts with a turning inside out, where the ectoderm, endoderm, and mesoderm change places, and that's the first move you ever made. We might say, from kind of a poetic perspective, if it is indeed this adiabatic or self-conserving of charge which really dimples the egg, then we might conclude that